I know that at the end of the day, whichever game wins Game of the Year at the Game Awards doesn't really ultimately matter, but every year when the nominees are announced, it always prompts discussion. Sometimes that discussion isn't really useful, but I think that this year there's been some genuinely interesting conversations sparked by the picks. Yes, there's some controversy, but I do think the controversy is worth discussing in this instance. So let's take a look at the 6 games individually and talk about why and how each of them has earned a nomination for Game of the Year. We might as well start with the one that's absolutely caused the most disagreement by its nomination, and that's Elden Ring: Shadow of the Erdtree. It's a pretty controversial pick because it's not a standalone game, it's a DLC expansion for Elden Ring, a game that on its own won Game of the Year a few years back. For a whole lot of people, it just doesn't quite feel right for Shadow of the Erdtree to receive this nomination. I put out a poll a few days ago asking if DLC or expansions should be eligible to win Game of the Year, and an overwhelming majority of people voted against the idea. This marks the first time that an expansion like this has ever been nominated for Game of the Year. And honestly, it may have a chance of winning considering that it's technically the highest rated piece of gaming content to have been released this year. If it does win, I foresee a lot of disgruntled gamers and probably even some loss of faith in the Game Awards in general. They might consider adding a separate dedicated award for DLC, expansions, and remasters so that they avoid this controversy in the future. Personally, I think that would be the best thing to do because I do think that expansions like Shadow of the Erdtree deserve to be recognized and praised for their achievements. In the same way that it feels off for a DLC to get nominated for Game of the Year, it also feels off for expansions and DLCs to get completely ignored just because they're not standalone games. I'm really glad to see Astro Bot get a nomination for Game of the Year. I think this is probably my personal favorite game from 2024. I genuinely think that it deserves to be in the conversation for not only Game of the Year, but potentially one of the best 3D platformers of all time. Seriously, it rivals, if not exceeds, some of the very best Mario games. Every aspect of Astro Bot, from the movement to the level design, is polished to perfection, and every moment of gameplay is nothing but pure fun. Surprisingly, it hasn't sold as well as I think it should have, but maybe being recognized as a nominee for Game of the Year will help drive some traffic its way. If it wins, I think it would definitely help it out. Kind of like how It Takes Two saw a big bump in sales after it won Game of the Year back in 2021. The slow sales can probably be blamed on the fact that it's a PS5 exclusive. I think that Nintendo Switch owners would have eaten this game up, but since it's a Sony IP, I don't think we'll be seeing Astro make an appearance on Nintendo hardware anytime soon. It will almost certainly make its way to PC eventually though, so at least there's some good news for people who aren't able to play it right now. And speaking of PS5 exclusives, Final Fantasy VII Rebirth also got a nomination for Game of the Year. This is one that I'm kind of torn on. When I look back at the past year of gaming, I do think that Rebirth is probably one of the better games I played, but I had some serious issues with the game's pacing and overall structure. I personally think the game was much too padded and stretched out. That being said, the core gameplay was super engaging, the story was fun, and the card game that you can play within the game, Queen's Blood, it was way better than it had any right to be. And to play devil's advocate, I guess there is something to be said about getting the most bang for your buck, and Rebirth definitely gives you a lot of content to work through. So ultimately, I think I am glad that this game is here and open for consideration, and I do think it deserves a spot as a nominee. Next is Metaphor Refantazio. This game getting a nomination is probably the one that I would have felt the most comfortable betting on being here. It's a game published by Atlas, and it's from the director and a good bit of the team behind Persona. This is the game that they started working on after Persona 5, a game that was truly loved by fans of JRPGs. I'm sure that plenty of gamers would have expected Persona 6 to be the next game from that team, but instead they delivered Metaphor. Here's the deal though, Metaphor has been completely embraced by the fan base. It's very similar to Persona, but it swaps the school theme for traditional fantasy. Knights, dragons, fairies, they're all here, and the game reviewed super well with both critics and users. I'm sure plenty of people will be voting for this one to win, and it definitely deserves a spot here. Black Myth Wukong took the world by storm earlier this year, and although it's not even really close to being one of the highest rated games of the year, there's no denying that it was definitely one of the most hyped games of the year. I think that's ultimately what led this game to being nominated for Game of the Year. So many people had a blast with it. It's not quite a Souls-like, but it's almost, and I think that really helped the game appeal to both the hardcore and more casual gaming audiences. Plus, Black Myth Wukong absolutely blew up in China, where gamers there seem to really appreciate playing a game based on Journey to the West, which is a traditional Chinese story. I'll be honest, I didn't 100% expect this game to get nominated, but in retrospect, I do think that it made a big enough impact to deserve a nomination. Finally, Unfortunately, almost every year, one indie game makes a big enough splash to be nominated for Game of the Year, and this year it was Balatro. Truthfully, I kind of thought that Animal Well might take Balatro's place here. Animal Well was my favorite indie game of the year, but I know that Balatro is probably the indie game that hooked the most gamers in 2024. What's crazy is that this game was developed by a single person, so seeing it compete against games made by teams of hundreds of people is just insane. It's a poker-themed roguelike deck building game, which sounds crazy, I know, but so many of my friends absolutely adore Balatro. That being said, because it's an indie game, it probably is the game that has the lowest name recognition, but I wouldn't completely count it out of the race just because of that. I kind of doubt it'll happen, but if it ends up winning Game of the Year, it will be the ultimate proof that indie games should not be ignored. Now that we've covered the 6 games that were nominated, let's talk about which games got snubbed. Some people were surprised that there were no Nintendo games nominated for Game of the Year. Nintendo did have a decent year. The Legend of Zelda Echoes of Wisdom really stands out to me, but I'm not too surprised that it or any other Nintendo game didn't get nominated. The Switch is definitely in that calm before the storm period right now. I'm thinking that once the Switch 2 comes out, there will be some games that earn Nintendo a Game of the Year nomination. There were also some other games that people were surprised not to see. There was Helldivers 2 and Palworld. Both of those really blew up and kind of were super hyped, sort of the same way that Black Myth Wukong was, but Palworld is technically still in early access, so I'm not sure if that game can even qualify at all. And Helldivers 2, although it had a big splash initially, it does seem like the hype for that game has kind of died off, so I'm not too surprised to see that either of these 2 games didn't get nominated. The only game that I'm genuinely surprised didn't get nominated is the remake of Silent Hill 2. The original Silent Hill 2 is over 2 decades old at this point, and honestly, if this game had just been a remaster, I wouldn't have expected or wanted it to get nominated. But this remake adds and changes so much that I feel like it may have deserved a nomination. Other remakes like Resident Evil 4 have been nominated in the past, so the precedent is there, but a remake has never won Game of the Year, so I doubt it would have had much chance anyway. But I really liked it, so I'm kind of bummed. Before this remake of Silent Hill 2, I had never really given the Silent Hill series a chance, but this one inspired me to finally dive in. In fact, I recently did a full review of my experience with that game, so if you'd like to hear my thoughts about it, definitely check that out. So to wrap things up, I definitely want to know which of these 6 games do you think is most likely to win Game of the Year, and then also which one do you want to win? I think I'll be voting for Astro Bot. I really want it to win, but ultimately I really don't know which of these games is going to win Game of the Year. I hope you enjoyed this video. Thanks for making it all the way to the end. I really do appreciate it. I'll see you next time.